Hey, welcome back to the Zombie Tactics channel tonight. Just a kind of a short video. I wanted to explain something that has to do with a lot of questions I get about how I think through certain issues and why I come to some opinions that I have. So I just want to explain kind of some of the principles that I use in my thought processes really quickly. It might be boring for some of you. You might find it interesting. I think it has a lot of bearing on the kinds of topics that I discuss sometimes, particularly having to do with planning for difficult times if we have a societal issue of some kind or natural disasters, and also just having to do with just normal things like self-defense or having to employ a firearm to defend yourself, that kind of thing. I generally have three different categories that I put information or ideas into, and the categories go roughly like this: fantasy, fiction, and reality. That's three, I'm counting them. And I'm sure there's some subcategories there as well. But they basically go like this. Fantasy is anything that you pretty much know for a fact it either can't happen because it's just plain structurally impossible. You can't make an object that's a circle and a square at the same time. It just ain't going to happen. That's just a physical impossibility. It's a logical impossibility. Or it's stuff that is so fantastical that it cannot be taken seriously. A zombie apocalypse falls into that category, as strangely as that might sound for a guy whose online moniker is Zombie Tactics. Now, those of you who've watched the channel for a while realize that I don't think there will ever be actual zombies, but that it's just kind of a humorous metaphor for all kinds of other different weird situations and things like that. But zombies, vampires, werewolves, that's something you can't plan for. You might say, well, I'm going to put silver bullets in my gun so that if I happen to run into a werewolf at the AM, PM, well, I'm covered. Well, okay, I suppose, silver tip is fine. And it's not that expensive, I suppose, but that's a fantasy. It's not something you can really plan for because it's just not real. It's not going to happen. Your active shooter incident is not going to end up being Bigfoot with an RPG and a Hughes minigun. It's just not real, okay? So that's fantasy, and that's pretty clear. That's a clear line for most people. It gets fuzzier as we go along, strangely enough, as we get more towards reality. You'd think it would be easier for us to identify reality than it would be to identify fantasy, but I found that it's the other way around, and that's another reason why I'm doing this video. Next we come to reality, and that's on the opposite end of the spectrum from fantasy. And reality is stuff that we absolutely know happens. We know it happens because we can read about it happening. There's video of it happening. There's reports of it's happening all the time. When we look at natural disasters and see what's happened during natural disasters, we can tell what's going to happen during other natural disasters that are similar in nature. That's just reality. The quickest way to determine the future is to figure out what happened before. The same thing's going to happen again under similar circumstances. You take a look at self-defense scenarios, you take a look at active shooter scenarios, you take a look at any kind of outbreak of disease or societal collapse, economic issues, whatever you want to talk about. And if it's happened a certain way, you can say, that's reality. Here's what happened during these incidents. And by the way, that's what happens over and over again every time this stuff happens. I think that's real. Now, that one's surprisingly only less fuzzy to get your head around than it is the idea of zombies and vampires being complete fantasy, and only because sometimes information isn't always 100% clear about every particular incident that happens. And I've talked a little bit about that before. There are books like, what's the name of the book I'm thinking? The Unthinkable. In that book, the point is made how people under stress, the machinery that goes towards forming memories and things like that kind of shuts down a little bit. And sometimes eyewitness testimony is less than perfectly reliable. But still, if we take a look at a number of different instances over time, we can see what happens. And what happens is reality. It's reality because we know it did happen, and that's a good predictor of what's going to happen in the future. I know that's repeating myself, but I think to hammer this home is a good idea. Now, the third thing is the fuzziest one of all, and it's the one that causes us the most problems whenever we want to talk about any of this kind of stuff. Self-defense, handguns, societal collapse, natural disasters, what kind of prepping we ought to do. What are the dangers of prepping? What are the dangers of prepping this way, that way, the other way? Should we even prep at all? And that is the area in between that I call fiction. And fiction, for my purposes, is stuff that is possible, but it either didn't actually happen that way, or it's never happened that way, or there's reason why we should suspect it never really would happen that way. No matter how possible it seems. It's just so improbable, or it's never happened that way before, that we shouldn't place any faith in it. And this is the area where I find the most amount of problems where people go about planning for any kind of a thing like that. They will take a look at it and they'll say, well, I'm going to carry this kind of gun because this is what I'm worried about. And you find out the thing that they're worried about is something that, like, will show me an instance where that's ever happened. You know, one of my favorite ones like this, and I know somebody's going to hate me for saying this, is people who are constantly in gun forums asking, what kind of handgun should I carry to defend myself against a bear? That just, it happens so rarely. And the handgun is such a poor choice in the first place to defend yourself against a bear, that if you're going camping and your biggest worry is what kind of handgun you should have to defend yourself against a bear, you're thinking of the problem all wrong. See, that's fiction. You may have even actually heard one or two really isolated instances where that happens, but that just almost never happens. So why are you really that worried about it? You know, put your food up the right way when you're camping so that bears can't get to it and you're not attracting bears. Maybe camp someplace where there's not bears. That's a much easier way to solve the problem than worrying about whether, is 10 millimeter good enough? I just don't know. And should I go with FMJ or jacketed hollow points, or is there any kind of armor piercing round that's especially good on bear hide? You know, that's just, it's possible. And it's maybe actually happened before that somebody's defended themselves against a bear with a handgun, but it's just kind of so fictional that we really can't wrap our heads around it. So fictional stuff is the stuff that's in between the fantasy and the reality that's kind of, it's just possible enough, or maybe it's happened a couple of times in all of human history, but it's the wrong thing for us to be thinking about. We should not make our plans around those things. We should stick to the things that actually happen. Now, another reason, besides the fact that people choose things that are just so improbable that they'll never happen in the area of fiction, are the areas where people get caught up with statistical analyses, which they start saying, well, the average this happens, or the majority of the time that this happens, so that's all I'm worried about. And I'm going to do a future video, kind of a follow-on to this one, about statistics and how you can get fooled by them into thinking that some things are never going to happen when they're actually quite common. It's something that you might want to plan for. So, fantasy, reality, and in the middle, fiction. And those are the categories that I put things into. Stuff that's never ever going to happen because it's impossible, you know, elephants with wings, with mounted submachine guns. And on the other side, reality, the stuff that happens all the time that we know happens, and we can know how it happens because we just study how it happens every time. Every time it happens that way. That's reality. And then in the middle, fiction. Stuff that's either made up because we see it on TV, or we read a bunch of gun magazines that have fictional accounts of things that never really happened that way, it turns out. That middle area is one of the things that I really want to count on spending some time about in future videos having to do with self-defense and gun handling and preparing for hard times. Just sharing you a little bit of my philosophy, how I put these things into certain categories, and hopefully that's some help for you understanding some of the future material that's going to happen on the Zombie Tactics channel. That's Zombie Tactics for tonight, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.